Hello, and welcome to the Agile Planet podcast. My name is Mandar Kulkarni, and I'm the host of this podcast. I will be interviewing the Agile experts from all over the world, taking the pulse of the planet Agile. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you for joining. Hello, and welcome to the Agile Planet podcast. Today we are here with another guest, and our today's guest is from Pune, India. Pune being my hometown, I have a special affiliation, of course, with this guest, and his name is Vishal Prasad. To introduce himself quickly, I can say that Vishal is an agile practitioner by day and a proud podcaster by night. Passionate about agility, Vishal has more than a decade of experience in multiple industry verticals. He is author in the making, also educator, blogger, and he is the organizer of a business agility meetup that happens in Pune. With this short introduction from my side, I would welcome Vishal with a request that he can introduce himself with little bit more details than what I did for him. So Vishal, you are welcome to this podcast and go ahead and introduce yourself to us.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Mandar. Really great to be a part of your podcast. Yeah, so I have been an agile enthusiast for quite some time now. I don't really remember when the transition happened, but I'm happy that it happened, and it's just been an amazing journey even for me. And yeah, as you said, author in the making. Yeah, that's kind of a goal that I've been trying to achieve since the past 3 years, and it's I think I'm just procrastinating on that, but hopefully it happens this year. And yeah, let's see how it goes. So I'm currently engaged with as a consultant with ThoughtWorks in Pune,
Mhm.
and ThoughtWorks kind of goes synonymous with a lot of agile initiatives that have happened in the past, and it's still known for its for a lot of the differences that you can compare with other companies. So I'm really lucky to be a part of it,
Mhm.
and it's more or less like a DNA. So anything that I do, I hope that it speaks something at the level of values and principles about, let's say, the manifesto, extreme programming, and other stuff. So yeah,
Okay.
that's me.
Perfect. So let's get started a little bit from your work perspective. You are saying
Mhm.
that you are with a company which is a consulting company. Am I right?
Yep.
Yeah. So as a consultant from this company, I'm sure you must have worked for various clients, and as we described, you have a experience from multiple verticals. Pick up a
Mhm.
couple of great experiences that you had in your career where with specific focus on where you had to implement agile in such a way which is little bit unusual way of doing it, or what I would say which is not recommended by the books, but you tweaked it, you tuned it, you adjusted it in such a way that it fits the culture of the organization and the
Mhm.
adoption goes up.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that I did something that is tweaked by the books. Well, there are tweaks.
Mm-hmm.
The tweaks are more at the practices level.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the principles and values don't really change.
Sure.
So even if let's say, if I go back to basics, when you say individuals and interactions over processes and tools, that's
Mm-hmm.
the value. You still stick with it. How you achieve that, the practice behind it can be different. And especially in my context, a lot of the things or a lot of the projects that I've worked on, they have usually been distributed between different countries. So the clients are usually, so I usually work with European and UK clients,
Mm-hmm.
but I work out of India. So we are already remote in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the practices where it get tweaked automatically, not something that we try out, but let's say the constraints make us do it.
Mm.
So let's take, for example, if I'm talking Scrum, okay? And in my previous organization, I worked with a lot of German clients, which automatically gives me like a 4.5 or 3.5 hours difference based on the time of the year. But let's say that if I'm towards the end of my iteration, and I have to go through the regular review and retrospective.
Sure.
But you don't have a lot of overlap. So what do you do? And that's when it starts becoming creative or tricky at the same time as to how do you ensure that you still don't waste a lot of time, but you achieve what you want to achieve. So there are a few tweaks which happen. For example, let's take the daily meetings that we have, whether we call it daily stand-up or daily scrum, depending on what people use. The rule still remains the same. Once 24 hours, you plan, and it shouldn't go beyond 15 minutes, sure. But because of the time zone, a lot of things change. Like usually in India, if you go to office in the morning, the first thing that you would expect would be that you plan your day. But now that shifts because you have part of the team, which is in Germany, which has not yet started their day. Their day is still about to start. So your planning time kind of shifts. Something around your lunchtime, which brings its own challenges. So it's perfectly fine if you meet during lunchtime and you plan for the next 24 hours. From a rule perspective, that's perfect. But what do you do if the next day someone falls sick, for example? And then you have to replan in the day anyway. So when you walk into the office in the morning, well, not anymore, now we are in COVID situation, but when you would walk into the office in the morning, you would have to replan. So even though your typical event will say you plan once, planning happens repetitively. The 15-minute is more like a mandatory planning. You have to do it because that gives you like a goal for the day to achieve. But you'll meet more frequently for plannings. So that's the kind of a tweak that happens. And rather, I wouldn't even call it a tweak. That's the freedom that certain rules give you. They make some things mandatory, but the other things you're free to do. And that freedom is what brings in agility. So everything from these ceremonies, the moment you go remote, all of these things change.
Sure.
But then what never happened to me like before, but happened to me just 2 years back on one of the products that I was working on, was again, it was the same Pune German setup. So it was still a German client. But this time, my product owner was the only person who was remote. So I'm calling him remote because the rest of the team was in Pune. And he was such a wonderful person. He agreed and said that if it's just 2 times in 2 weeks, I'm happy to wake up in your hours and ensure that your planning does not get affected. Which was so cool because now I had everything that fell into place for my development team. They came in the morning to the office. They had one stand-up for their entire day planning. They did not have the constraint of, what happens tomorrow if someone falls sick, for example, or something happens because of which people can't show up. And my product owner was happy to wake up at 6 in the morning, 2 days in 2 weeks, just to take care of the planning and review and retrospective, which was cool. But these are kind of like wonderful tweaks that happen, but it doesn't break the values and principles, and that makes it a great experience.
Certainly. So in all these experiences, now since you mentioned that one of your clients was in Germany, and you work with many other European clients, I would like to know if you have observed any change in the culture which impacts your project from agile perspective, or the way with which agile is adopted from one country in Europe to another country, or not necessarily only in Europe, but one country to another country to another country, or even you can take it from industry to industry to industry. Do you see any changes that happen because industry changes, because the country changes?
Yeah, of course. So let's take the country aspect first. The cultural differences are obviously there. And I think for me, the one that stood out the most was when I was working with a few Dutch clients. Now, I like working with them because they are very direct and to the point. And they wouldn't mind giving a bad news or even a good news with a straight face. And that's really amazing to see, because if I want to compare that with, let's say, someone in the Indian context, we do feel a little like we feel that it is our responsibility to not give bad news. So we try to bring out the sweetest possible message. I'm not calling it sugarcoating, but we find the sweetest possible message so that others don't feel bad. And I think that that's a place where we kind of sometimes beat around the bush, and it may frustrate a few people, especially when I say a few people. If you're working with someone who's Dutch, they'll be open and they'll say, just give it to me. Just tell me on my face what's going on. You don't need to be sweet with me. You don't need to sugarcoat things for me. Whatever it is, it's fine. And these kind of small cultural differences, something that you'll find all the time. And it's like when you start building relationship and when the trust factor comes in and you have spent a considerable amount of time working with them, then you look back at these things and you laugh. Because then these become funny stories. Like, remember in that meeting where production had gone down and you were trying to give me the best possible reason why I shouldn't be worried about it. And these become like funny stories to talk about, because at that time because we do not understand each other's cultural differences, we just try to be ourselves. And I think at that time it's easier just to know what the other culture accepts and just act that way. But obviously not everyone has that knowledge about the cultural sensitivity, so it may not come naturally to everyone. I was lucky enough again. So around 5 years back, when I started working with German and Dutch clients, I did go through a German and Dutch sensitivity class where they explained these things to me. And it was an eye-opener in a number of cases for me. For example, the German aspect of how they perceive, let's say, World War versus what the Indian textbooks will teach you World War. That has a drastic difference. Like, there are things which if we would consider to be like a good step or like a great step that would have taken in World War, no, that's not perceived by them at all. And these things were made clear, and I was surprised as to how we don't take all of that in our context when we speak with someone. For example, if you walk into a bookstore in India, you'll find Hitler's autobiography like a bestseller right in front of the store, and you can pick up one of the books and move out, and you'll feel that that's an autobiography worth reading. Germans won't feel that. Like, for Germany, that book is banned. You can't sell that book, at least not in the open.
Oh, okay.
So these are things which you wouldn't normally come to know. And if you're, let's say, fresh out of college, and your history is still fresh in your mind, whatever you have studied in school, and suddenly you're thrown in front of a German client without this knowledge, forget agility. Just building up the relationship might go through some ups and downs. So yeah, I think these cultural differences do exist, and it is important for us to ensure that we do the best that we can to adapt to each other's culture.
Of course. You have made a very good point that the interpersonal relationship is where everything starts. But my real question, and there may be no good answer for that, or may not be the best answer for that. But my question is, these personal relationships, and once you understand how these people accept something culturally, how they don't accept something culturally, the differentiation between what you do in India and what you do with other countries, do they make any impact while you work in an agile project? That is what my real question is.
It does. So as I said, right, if you adapt to each other's way of working, then things improve. But in the initial phases, at least, it always does. And I think a lot of the times it's less to do with the culture, but more to do with how educated someone is when they are thinking of agility.
Okay.
So going back to, let's say, the example where if I have to give a reasoning of why we should have retrospectives, I need to make someone understand from their cultural standpoint of why someone needs retrospective. As opposed to, I cannot say that we want to have retrospectives because we are agile. That won't be a good answer. I mean, being agile doesn't mandate that you need to have retrospectives, but there's a reason why you would have retrospectives. And it becomes necessary for me to make someone understand the importance of a retrospective. And yeah, cultural differences may create certain barriers over there. So language barriers, let's say that still is something that we'll manage, because if you're working in a team, we'd expect that we all speak the same language. Mostly for us, it is English. But let's say going back to someone who's very, let's say, rigid with their ways of working. And if you want to convince them as to why empirical processes are important or why it has to be integrated in the way of working, like it's not bad if someone expects that, hey, everything should work perfectly. Obviously, everything should work perfectly. That will be the ideal scenario, but that doesn't happen. But what you can do is attempt to move towards perfection. And that's what retrospectives help you to do it. Now, this message is very simple, but making this message understand to different people who come from different cultural backgrounds, even different experiences. For example, an organization that has been a very command and control kind of a thing, for them to make them understand what self-organization is all about and why you need to give the team the freedom to do it. Yeah, it takes time. So culture is a lot driven by what your past experience has been and what your practices has been. So
absolutely,
I think what's necessary is to understand the reasoning behind it and make the other person understand in the best possible way that they accept their culture. And it just cannot be a thing that, hey, we need to do it because we are agile. I have heard that answer so many times, and I kind of cringe whenever I hear that. Like, no, that can't be a reason. We do stand-ups because we are agile. No, you do stand-ups because you need a day plan so that you have a goal which you can manage. And so for me, education becomes more important. And that's why I focus more on education and being an educator. And the cultural aspect obviously is like a secondary thing which you have to manage. But it has to be the education that goes into the cultural aspect for me.
I agree with you that education is a very significant part of being consultant and being agile coach, particularly because coaching by default, by definition, inherently expects that you are an educator. While we were talking before this interview, you mentioned that education comes in various forms, and you mentioned that your podcast, your blog is also part of the education. Tell us a little bit about educational aspect of your podcast and your blog.
Sure. So let's start with the podcast. That's new.
Okay.
So the subtitle I have for my podcast is Educating Organizations to be Awesome. And the title goes Enterprise Joy. And the idea behind it is that your final outcome or the final expected thing is still that you have an organization that has this crazy culture that satisfies people in all aspects that they would expect. Now, all aspects may be exaggerated, but all aspects for one individual, and every individual will have different aspects. But the idea is, how would you even understand what is it that satisfies your people if you do not know let's say, the latest research that has happened or the way the organization behavior works? And that's where the educational aspect comes in. So on the podcast, I'll usually discuss about these theories, which have been proven to be better ways of running organizations or running teams or running products. And it wouldn't be like a Blackboard session. I wouldn't show up some text or some PPTs and just say, hey, this is how you should do it. I'm not even asking you that this is how you should do it. It's more of a discussion. We discuss like, hey, have you done this before? And how has that proven for you? Or what if you do it differently? And what will be the possible result? And these kind of discussions is something that brings out more ideas.
Yeah.
And that's why I say education comes in different forms. So it wouldn't be like a webinar. It will be a discussion, but just listening to it should give you enough ideas that you can go and make certain changes in your organization. So that's also one form of education. Blogging is more direct. Blogging is just taking up a topic and stating the facts with proper references. Hey, this is what it is. So if you have some confusion, please get it clarified. And it will be, it's not very acceptable to a lot of people about the general education, or rather, let me put it this way. If we believe that we only learn by experience, then that will be wrong. There are certain things which come out of experience and pop out as sound theories. And that theory has to be propagated further.
Okay.
But you need a reference, you need a source that is authentic, and you need a source that has some credibility behind it. And unless you have that, people don't accept theory. And theory as well is something that many people find boring. I'm one of the exceptions. I find it interesting. So my job is to take the theoretical aspect and make it as interesting as possible so that people like to accept it in the practical scenarios also.
Sure.
And I try to strive as hard as possible to do that. So my blogs are very sarcastic, to be very honest. There are times when people would read it and they wouldn't understand what it is, but that's just because I take it a little far than I should sometimes. But it is heavily dependent on sarcasm, and so is the book that I'm writing. It is full of sarcastic situations which make you think. The idea is still to make you think. Like if you read it, it'll feel like a very normal situation, and in your head you'll be like, yeah, this is how it's supposed to be, isn't it? But then you kick in the theoretical aspect and you say this is why it shouldn't be, and people go, oh, we missed that. And just to create that experience for people, it's satisfying for me.
Sure. It will be very interesting to read your book, so I'll be looking forward to.
I hope I find a publisher who has the guts to print it. Yeah, but okay. I'm hoping it happens. Yeah.
Right. Let's go back to again work part of your consulting work and agile work. Here is my curious question based on my current experience with working in agile, especially from the SAFe consultant perspective. I have been working in SAFe for the last 5 years, and various companies of various sizes. That is definitely. But I have not worked in any other particular frameworks like LeSS or Scrum of Scrums. Do you have any experience or insights in any frameworks that are popular in the market? And would you like to give your experiences or insights or share that with us, with our audience?
Sure. So I'm not that much into SAFe. It has been like a goal for me to get into SAFe since the past few years now, but I have not been able to do that. I'm more of a Scrum and XP guy.
Okay.
So when it comes to Scrum or extreme programming, that's usually where my interests lie. And for me, a lot of the problems that I try to tackle they kind of fall into these two buckets. So it's something where I have not left the arenas, at least yet. And one can always say that, hey, because you don't have interest in other things, that's why you maybe you don't know what other solutions you can have. Sure, that is a possibility. I wouldn't deny that. But it's not that I don't venture into other things. It's more focused towards the Scrum and XP thing that I provide. And the funny thing that I have observed a lot of times is that you have these two communities, which are a community of like pure Scrum enthusiasts, and then you have a community of pure XP enthusiasts, and they usually don't like each other. Because there's one, like the XP has this XP practitioners can very well say that, hey, Scrum does not provide any steps for how you should actually build software, for example, which is highly important because you need to know the good engineering practices in order to build software, which is a valid point. But the Scrum practitioners would say, hey, that's where we are giving you the freedom. Because we are not binding you by certain practices, we are giving you the freedom. Sure. And one may feel that this is a point where the two of these groups should fight, but for me, it is like a good complement to each other. There are quite a few overlaps between XP and Scrum. A few of those overlaps are not very direct, but there are two statements in both of these frameworks that make it easy for this merger to happen, and I think a lot of people miss that out. So if I go through Scrum, and the new version has not yet come out, I think it's supposed to come out in this month. But the Scrum guide, usually if you go to the bottom, there's one sentence that says that you can do part of Scrum. No one's going to stop you. There's no Scrum police. But if you don't do Scrum in its entirety with all the events and the artifacts and the rules, then don't call it Scrum, because Scrum is immutable. And unless you're performing the entire framework in its entirety, don't call it Scrum. XP, on the other hand, the moment Kent Beck starts his book, Extreme Programming Explained, which is kind of a Bible for XP, he says every team does XP differently. Like, this is the two big contrasts between the frameworks. One framework suggests that you have to do it by the rules. And the other one says that, hey, every team does it differently. So don't be scared if you see people doing things differently. But the one place where both of them converge is, it's fine if you do things differently, but don't mess with the values and principles. And both Scrum and XP have a set of values.
Sure.
And those values overlap. You got courage in XP, you got courage in Scrum, you got respect in Scrum, you got respect in XP. You got self-organizing team and flow and focus and everything. So like the principles are exactly the same, but your practices differ.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why for me, Scrum and XP become like a complementary thing. And I'm happy to embrace both because there are a lot of overlaps that I can use. And since I am related to software development, I build software for my clients. It kind of, XP becomes like a natural thing that flows. So everything from test first development to ensuring continuous integration happens, continuous delivery, and all of that comes from XP. But at the same time, running an iteration, inspecting and adapting, that's much closer to Scrum. And it's very easy for me to combine the two. Okay. So that's the reason why I have been a Scrum and XP guy for a very long time, because it fits my purpose. And that's usually where I work. So it's very limited to these two.
Okay. So Vishal, it's almost time for us to wrap up this chat. And as a parting thoughts, I would really like to request you that the audience that is going to listen to this podcast from all over the world, certainly like to take away a couple of key points that you want from your experience to share with others. Do you have 1, 2, or 3 key takeaways that people should really remember out of this podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. So the major key takeaway for me would definitely be the education aspect of it. And it's very close to my heart. And for me, getting educated in any particular theme or context or even methodologies is highly important for getting good results. And think of it as the first step. Once you have got yourself educated and done it the way we are supposed to do it, let's say the textbook way of doing it, then you're free to experiment. And the experimentation comes the second part. You need to experiment frequently. But all of your experiments, rather most of your experiments, are going to fail. But that's not something that should dishearten you. That's a good thing. So one of the attitudes that we need to build in ourselves is the attitude of learning to fail. Like, we need to be so comfortable with failure that we don't mind taking the risk of doing something new.
Wow.
And do it as frequently as possible. So education will still be like my first stand, that you need to first get your, like if you're a physicist, you need to first understand what physics is.
Yeah.
And the same thing applies to Agile. If you want to be a good agilist, then you need to first understand what Agile and agility is all about. So educate yourself well, but once you have done that, frequently experiment and see how things work out, and get used to failing, because that's what brings in innovation, and that is what will push people beyond. So
perfect.
As long as we can do that, at least it makes me happy.
Yep.
And let's see.
I really like the way with which you concluded this chat, that educate, experiment, and learning to fail. Thank you so much, Vishal, for your time. Thanks a lot for being a guest on my podcast. And best of luck for your podcast. All my best wishes for you being a published author. And we all will look forward to get and read your book as soon as it is published in the market. So please keep us posted. And
absolutely.
I really look forward to talk with you after a few days, maybe once your book is published, and we'll invite you to share that experience on this podcast again. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Mandar. It was nice to be here.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, share, and subscribe to this podcast and to this YouTube channel. Thank you.